If you don't know me, I'm Elliot. I work mostly for Yorkshire North and East Methodist District as their digital communications enabler. But I do also do one day a week for the connectional team, for the communications team, helping them with social media and various other projects. But most of my time is in my district role, and that's all about helping equip and support local churches and circuits with everything really, from social media, websites, Zoom, graphic design, photography, online worship, editing videos, and so on. So I have a working knowledge of all things digital and in the online area. So I'm sure you can tell my expertise is in the digital side of things rather than safeguarding, which is why this session is focusing on understanding online platforms for church safeguarding in that context. I am passionate about safeguarding and have become more and more involved in safeguarding over the last year or so, and are now also part of our district safeguarding group, particularly because of the digital knowledge that I bring to this area, and that's becoming increasingly important. Hopefully this session will be at a level that will be helpful for everyone, and there'll be something everyone can get out of it. It's always slightly difficult when people have different backgrounds and different skill levels, but I hope I've set it at about the right level for you. In terms of what I'm hoping to cover, the online area is really huge. It's a really vast area. I don't claim to know everything about the internet or every digital topic, so it's almost impossible to cover everything within an hour. My plan is to go into detail in some specific areas which I think will be helpful for you, and broadly cover some other areas, and we'll see how we go with time. Generally, I'm not going to cover the dangers and statistics for children, guidance for parents or youth workers. This session is specifically for us to help us understand what these online platforms are, what some of the challenges are, the jargon, and why it's unique for churches, particularly thinking from a church perspective. So that's the aim. So firstly then, just to paint the picture broadly and explain why I'm starting where I am, these are the latest statistics for the world's most used social media platforms from January this year. The figures are from Hootsuite and We Are Social, who together do annual reports and also quarterly updates. They do UK specific data, but that doesn't come out till mid-February. So I'm keeping my eyes out for when that is released. It'll be interesting to see what that shows. But again, just to highlight, these are global figures, which is why there are some social media platforms down the left-hand side which you may never have heard of before or are not familiar with. But clearly, right at the top, Facebook is by far the most popular and largest platform still. Still the most used. It does depend on demographics, but overall it's still sitting at the top. It's also the most complicated platform, in my opinion, and it's what most of our churches are currently using, which is why I'm going to start there first. So let's take a look at Facebook. Hopefully, for those of you who use Facebook personally, some of this will be familiar to you, but I'm hoping to dive deeper into some of the more complex parts that are particularly relevant to churches, but I'll also try and keep it accessible to those who aren't as familiar with Facebook. So I'm going to go into each of these in more depth, and initially this might seem quite straightforward to those who are familiar with Facebook, but I still come across many people who struggle to understand the difference between these three main ways of interacting on Facebook. So in simple terms, on the right-hand side we have profiles, and this is created when you set up an individual account on Facebook. It's for individual people in a personal capacity. And then on the left-hand side, you have Facebook pages, which are for businesses, organizations, charities, and particularly churches. It's easiest to think of these in terms of being like a website. It's a public front-facing page for the church. And this is what churches should have, not a personal profile. And in the middle we have groups, which maybe are the easiest to understand. I think they're quite self-explanatory. It's a place on Facebook where a community group can gather and interact with each other. They can be in that space, they can post, talk and discuss. So let's look at some of the specifics. Again, if you use Facebook personally, hopefully you're already familiar with quite a bit of this on personal accounts. I'm sure you're all aware of the terminology of friending people. It does get a bit more confusing these days, as you can also follow people, which is a separate function. Following is the act of subscribing to see their updates on your homepage. So you can friend people and not follow them, or not friend people but still follow them to see their public updates. And that's just one example of how the platforms change rapidly and evolve. The terminology changes, the functionality changes, and it gets a bit messy. Often our guidance struggles to keep up with the pace of change and what you can and can't do on these platforms because of that. But as with everything I'll talk about on this slide and on many others as well, nearly everything is subject to settings. I can make broad statements about how we can interact and contact people online, but it will always be subject to privacy settings. Everything on your personal Facebook profile, the things we share and what people can see is all subject to our settings. Because of that, people can post on our profile, but only if our settings allow it. And I've listed some other things there where ways we can interact and communicate, but again, only if our settings are set up in that way. Messenger is a bit of a complicated one. It is an integrated part of Facebook in that you can chat one-to-one directly with people or in groups, but it is also a separate app, a separate entity. You might have seen on the first slide of statistics, it actually measures Facebook Messenger as a completely separate platform, Facebook and Facebook Messenger. So again, it gets a bit complicated, especially with Facebook also owning WhatsApp and Instagram. And there's kind of a broader picture of social media going on. But what's important here in terms of safeguarding and churches, and that's what I've put at the bottom, one of the key things I think is people having more than one account, which actually isn't allowed under Facebook's terms and conditions, but that's often overlooked or not always realized. Facebook is striving for authenticity and accountability in its users, particularly to avoid problems such as catfishing and things. And so an individual should only have one account, and they should use their real name. No fake names, job titles, or using the name of your church, for example, which is another issue of churches having a personal profile instead of a business page, which they should have. And that, of course, means they're using a platform that's not designed for how they will be using it. We shouldn't be friending churches, and there's many safeguarding implications for doing that the wrong way. And of course, it's not complying with Facebook's terms and conditions as well. And then there's other challenges, such as ministers using their personal account as the public face of the church, which may not seem like a particularly big issue on the face of it. I see ministers posting public updates, letting people know what's happening in their church, and so people start to follow them to keep up with news and information about the church. But it can then get difficult to distinguish between the personal and the professional life. Should people message the minister directly on Facebook to get in touch with the church? Where do we draw the lines? I see many ministers live streaming worship on their personal accounts, so members of the public are then being encouraged to comment and engage directly with the minister in that place for online worship. And what's the guidance around all of that? The only other thing to say about Facebook profiles, and it applies to all social media accounts, there's always this challenge of what we do with under 13s who have accounts who shouldn't do. You do need to be 13 to have an account on Facebook, as with many social media platforms, but many do sign up when they are below that age, including young people in our churches. So how do we deal with that situation? Moving on then to Facebook pages. Facebook pages then I think are going to be more about the church context. Everything on a Facebook page is public. As I've said, it's much like a website. Our congregation members or members of the public follow the page to see our updates and what we post. The main thing here, and how it's quite different for the church, is about who's managing these church pages and how we're looking after them. Facebook is a bit complicated, but it does provide us with different levels of access. This means we can assign people different roles and ways of looking after that church presence on Facebook. The little image on the screen on the right-hand side shows the different levels: admin, editor, analyst, moderator, and so on. The bottom three are ones that, or bottom two or even bottom three, I've rarely seen used, so you probably don't need to worry about them. But the top two, admin and editor, are very commonly used. But it just means we can give people access to post on behalf of the church without also giving them access to change the settings, remove other people, or even delete the page. Again, we don't have much guidance around how many admins we should have on our church Facebook pages and who they should be, if they need to be church members, if they need oversight, training, DBS checks, can they be under 18s? These people we are giving access can then speak on behalf of the church. They can act as the church online. They can communicate with people as the church and people outside the church. The main challenges and things for me, in my perspective, is how this is really different from the secular world. I've run some social media accounts for the National Trust briefly before, and I had to be an employed member of staff. I had to undergo additional training on best practice, what you can and can't post, what tone of voice to use, how to handle negative comments, and I had oversight from a marketing manager. In our church contexts, it's often one volunteer who has set up the page and has the tech skills. We don't often have much oversight by the minister or church leadership, as they don't always understand social media or how it works. They have no training, and not currently required to have a DBS or undertake the safeguarding training as I understand it. And because of that, I frequently see where only one person has access. They might leave the church, sometimes pass away, or leave employment of the church, and the church no longer has access to their own social media, and it's really hard to claim it back sometimes. So this is really important, both for keeping the church safe, keeping those managing the church pages safe, and also keeping the public safe. And there's lots of questions around what's best practice in this area. Should we have digital keyholder forms, for example, that social media admins sign, a bit like a physical keyholder form for a church building? So maybe here I've provided more questions than answers, but you'll see as we go along that this is a case in a lot of areas. Hopefully it gets us thinking and understanding the issues. So moving on to Facebook groups. You can join a group on Facebook, and then the group posts appear in your homepage newsfeed. Both personal profiles and church pages or other pages can join a group. Again, subject to settings, but usually they can. And again, it's tricky to give blanket statements here, as there's so many different ways to set them up. Groups can be public or private, and they can be visible or hidden. So there's actually 4 different categories of Facebook groups you can have, depending on how you toggle those settings. A public Facebook group means everything is in the public domain, so it can be quite a safe space as there's lots of transparency and accountability. On the other hand, a private group provides a safe space where others can't look in and protects the views and comments of those in the group, but does mean that there is this lack of transparency, and therefore there needs to be good moderation and people keeping an eye on discussions 24 hours a day, or at least being available 24 hours a day if needed. And a lot of the worries around Facebook group will come down to good admins and moderators and having those skills. I think groups can provide the most headaches in terms of safeguarding. We have a diverse community that is meeting together and interacting together in one space, quite unlike anything else. It's not always going to be a specific group, such as a youth group, for example, where the boundaries are quite clear. You've got leadership and you've got young people. But what are the guidelines for how people can interact or engage with each other in more general groups? We know, for example, that ministers or those in leadership positions shouldn't be friending, communicating, or interacting with those under 18 on social media. But can they do that within the bounds of a church Facebook group? Things become very blurred within groups because they are this melting pot space, and it's not quite as clear-cut as other spaces. As with many of these platforms, there's questions around: do the people that have control of the groups have the skills and training they actually need to manage it? I think in many cases they don't. We don't have much training, and there's generally a lack of digital skills within the church as it is. The admins have the ability to moderate discussions in the group. They can delete posts, delete comments, stop further commenting, remove members, and have many more functions. But do they know how to use them? So the last thing I want to touch on with Facebook, before moving on to a different platform, is Facebook Stories. I don't think they cause too many concerns, but I think their popularity will only grow. You may be familiar with stories on Instagram or maybe Snapchat. They are now on Twitter as well, so they are fast becoming a common feature of most social media platforms. So it is worth knowing a little bit about how they work. Just like Snapchat, they are only visible for 24 hours, which does cause some problems. It means we can struggle to trace back content if we were looking for past posts or need to record things. They are only there for 24 hours. But the main two differences really between this content and how you would normally share a post on Facebook would be that when you react to a story, that's clicking the like button, love, laugh, or the other options. By reacting, you create a one-to-one message with the person who posted it. So it is a form of establishing conversations directly with people, which could cause problems when we're talking about under 18s or vulnerable people. Both pages and profiles can post stories, and it's almost encouraging people to start a private conversation with us. We can also view everyone who's seen the stories. Unlike most other social media content, you don't normally get to see who's viewed your posts unless they have interacted with it in some way. People can remain hidden. But with stories, we have a visible list of everyone who has viewed the story. So moving away from Facebook a little bit, but we will still touch on it, moving on to online worship. This is an area that we don't look at very much. We often focus specifically on young people and youth groups, and that's definitely where a lot of our guidance lies within safeguarding. But to me, online worship brings up a lot of other challenges because of the way we are all engaging together. There are many ways to do it, as I'm sure you are aware, and the most common are usually Zoom, Facebook Live, or YouTube Live, or doing pre-recorded videos on one of those three platforms. The safeguarding concerns are going to be different for each of these ways of doing things. And we've already talked a bit about Facebook already, and we'll talk more about Zoom and YouTube in a moment, so I won't go into some of the details on screen about these different options just now. But as I've said before, I think one of the challenges is that the church community is a very different environment to other sectors. We are not a school that only deals with young people. We're not separated into teachers and students. We are a community that mixes and changes quite a lot. For example, one day a local preacher or volunteer with no online training could be doing a live stream prayer on Facebook in a leadership position, the next day suddenly watching and chatting in the comments alongside others during the prayers and interacting with those watching, whether they're vulnerable or young people. Those boundaries of when we are acting in a church capacity and when we are acting in a personal capacity suddenly become a lot more blurred in the online space, and we quickly switch between lots of different roles that we might hold. There is no guidance that I've ever found that covers some of these types of risk that a mixing online community like ours encounters. So here's some of my reflections around online worship and safeguarding, and why we're talking about this here in this session. How does it relate to safeguarding? So firstly, what technology are we using? Our guidance is fairly clear, that when we're filming or taking photos at a youth group, for example, it should be on church-owned equipment, a church-owned device. But we are all at home mostly at the moment and using personal devices. And what about those who are facilitating our online worship using their equipment or software, such as those hosting a Zoom meeting or using their streaming software to facilitate a live stream, or editing video using their own video editing software? Suddenly those people are in control of everything and have the power to monitor everything, record it, store it on their personal devices. Do these people have training? Can they look out for safeguarding issues? Do they need DBS checks and things if they're being sent videos of children to store on their personal computers? They are often people who are skilled in technology and not necessarily part of our church leadership or even a church member. When should we be using church-owned equipment, and when is it okay to use personal equipment? And then when do we need risk assessments? Do we need them for online worship? At any moment, we could have vulnerable people or people outside the church, young people, engaging with us on any of these platforms. Does any online event need a risk assessment? I think we're getting better, but we're still not used to writing risk assessments for events held in the online space, mostly as many don't understand how some of the platforms work and what all the risks are. Much like why I'm doing this session. And then there's issues around moderating comments on live streams. Normally live streams are public and anyone can comment. Can under 18s comment on a public church live stream? Can a church respond back to them and put a reply, even though we're not meant to be engaging with under 18s? But then how do we even know if they are under 18? On social media, we will just see a picture and a name usually, and we have no way of knowing what age they are before we interact with them. What about those on safeguarding contracts? How do they engage with online worship in that space? Are they allowed to comment on a public live stream? Of course, this leads into the challenges surrounding the fact that there aren't really any geographical areas in the online space. A lot of our safeguarding protocols and policies are built around geographical areas, districts and circuits. But actually, during the pandemic, we found that people go and attend online worship all over, and people can sometimes join from a different country. This poses questions. If there is a safeguarding concern, who does it get reported to? If someone comes and joins us and they are from a different country or area, they won't necessarily know who the minister is, who the safeguarding officer is, or even have a clue what our policies and protocols are. What about if someone with a safeguarding contract comes and joins online worship in a church or area where they are not known to have a safeguarding contract? And this leads into the fact that hosts and facilitators are different in the online space. We've already mentioned that they are often those with the technical know-how, and therefore they're not usually our stewards or welcomers who we might have in person, who might have had training. And going back to that scenario, if someone attends and there is a safeguarding incident, and they aren't from the local area, so don't know who to report it to, they are going to report it to the Zoom host or message the Facebook page, for example. and that will be received by the person facilitating, who is the techie. And they may also have no idea about our safeguarding policies and procedures and what to do with that. And that leads on to the last point, which is about how we recruit these tech and volunteer roles for online worship. We rely heavily on those with the technical skills to do a lot of this work. So we don't always think about, do they need training? Do they need a DBS check? I've heard many cases of where young people, in one case a 13-year-old, who helps run and host online worship on Zoom, which is great. The church are really enthusiastic. They have a young person who is committed and has the skills and is happy to help host online worship that they wouldn't be able to do otherwise. But actually, that young person has complete responsibility and control over that space. Have they been safer recruited? What procedures are in place? What training do they need to even fulfill that role? Are they capable to assess when there is a safeguarding concern? They are the one who is responsible for monitoring the chat, monitoring the live stream comments and things like that. I think these are things we haven't really considered. We want to be online, we want to engage with our communities, so we jump at the chance when someone offers their skills. And so maybe it's slightly different to when things were in person. So a lot of that does feed into Zoom, as a lot of online worship is on Zoom, obviously. So I won't go into this as much. I'm hoping a lot of you deal with Zoom quite often and therefore know most about it. So I don't need to go into some of the technicalities of what you can and can't do on the platform. But essentially it's all about the settings. Zoom has loads of them. And I think many people in our local churches don't know how to use them, and there's a general lack of skills again around how to use some of the features. When you're host or co-host, you have the ability to do all these things. You can eject people from the meeting, you can mute people, stop the chat, stop screen sharing. Instead, our current Methodist guidance is quite belt and braces of just don't share the link online. But we're not actually providing people with the skills to deal with issues if they were to arise. Many churches do have a waiting room in place, but as many of our congregations are less tech savvy and don't have an account or know how to name themselves, or maybe are joining on a phone, they appear in the waiting room as a random string of letters and numbers. And so most churches just let everyone in, making the waiting room mostly functionless. The same is true with passwords. Most churches do enable a password, which is great, but the password is contained within the link, and that's what we're sending round and sharing with people. So the password again becomes functionless because you don't need it if you have the link. So we come back to the need for having hosting skills to be taught, so people can actually react to issues when they arise and not just rely on preventative measures that actually provide very little protection. The only other thing I would draw your attention to with Zoom is young people and supervision, which I think is an ongoing discussion and thing really. But Zoom do currently say that under 16s can't use the platform, and that's not just about having an account, but it's not recommended for under 16s to use Zoom. Our Methodist legal team has been in contact with Zoom to confirm that it is acceptable for under 16s to use the platform on a parent's account and if they are supervised. But there's lots of interpretation around what that means in reality. Our Methodist guidance currently says it's about having a parent or guardian at home, just in the house. Schools and some teachers I've spoken to often define it as having an adult, a parent or guardian within earshot. And I've seen others define it on risk assessments as having an adult visible in the background of the child's screen. And so with all of this, there is a level of interpretation that goes on with our guidance, which can be really tricky when it comes to how do we implement some of these things practically in reality. Okay, so moving on to YouTube. YouTube is a huge platform. We saw on the slide of statistics at the beginning, it came in second as the second most used social media platform, but it is more than that. Most people who use it don't actually have an account, so won't appear in those figures. And that would apply to many of our church people who visit YouTube to watch church services, for example. And as such, YouTube is actually the second most visited web page on the internet, second only to Google itself, which of course owns YouTube. 1 billion hours of video are watched every day on YouTube, which is more than Netflix and Facebook videos combined, so it's huge. And of course, a huge amount is uploaded to YouTube. Over 8 hours of video are uploaded to YouTube every single second of every single day. But despite being a huge platform, to my mind, YouTube actually presents some of the least safeguarding worries. I know there are issues and worries around young people using the platform and what they are watching, but from a church perspective, most are using it for online worship, live streaming, or storing video. And so most of the churches I know have comments turned off. You can't message channels directly on YouTube, and so there's far less interaction compared to other social media platforms. There's not too much to really talk about with YouTube. Of course, it does have its own list of jargon and things, but I won't go through all of that now. I have had people ask me about autoplay. So what if people are watching a church video and the next video YouTube sends up to play is inappropriate content? It's not something that we can do a lot about or control, because it will depend entirely on the person's watch history and what YouTube thinks they will want to see next. But it does raise some wider questions, and not just specifically to YouTube, of how we safeguard older or vulnerable people who are new to the online space and don't have the skills to use some of these platforms in a safe way because they don't understand how it works. And finally, let's take a quick look at Instagram. Instagram is a complex platform nowadays. I would say just as complicated as Facebook, so it would take a long time, just as with Facebook, to go into proper depth with it. Instagram is slowly becoming more and more sophisticated, adding more and more features, and slowly becoming more like Facebook. I think there's a huge amount of jargon that comes with Instagram, and I won't be able to cover it all, but let's take a look at some of it. Firstly, let's talk about hashtags. They're not unique to Instagram, as I'm sure you're aware, originally from Twitter, but they're used on most platforms now, including Facebook. Hashtags are a way to categorize posts and link to others who are posting about the same topic. So if you click on a hashtag, you will see others who have posted with the same hashtag. So on these platforms where hashtags form a fundamental part of how you discover other content, such as Instagram and Twitter, it means we are more likely to interact and follow people we don't know in person, unlike Facebook, where usually people only friend those they know in real life. So what can you post on the platform? So we have feed posts, which is what Instagram was originally known for. This is sort of core Instagram, if you like. You can post a single image or a 60-second video or a carousel of up to 10 images or videos, and those will appear on your profile and in the home page for others to see. And then there's stories, which we've already talked about with Facebook. They're copied directly from Snapchat, and they work in exactly the same way. The only real difference to what we've talked about with Facebook is that on Instagram you can send stories directly to people as private messages, and they again disappear after 24 hours. There is IGTV, Instagram TV if you like, which is Instagram's answer to YouTube. It's for long form video, so anything longer than 60 seconds. And now we have the new Reels feature, which is Instagram's answer to TikTok and works identically, exactly the same way as TikTok. So if you have safeguarding concerns about Snapchat, about TikTok, about YouTube, about Facebook, about any of them really, you'll also have those same concerns about Instagram, as the features are all built within it. They're all there and they are the same. But in terms of safeguarding and privacy settings, there is a certain simplicity to some of the privacy settings on Instagram. You can have a public account or a private account. So your posts are either private, only viewable to your followers, or they're public and anyone can see them. But this does highlight some of the broader social media questions in general, such as how do we balance being a public-facing church whilst also protecting our people? For example, if we follow a church account, we subscribe to their content, but we also appear in their follower list of that church. And so we're effectively creating almost ready-made lists of vulnerable people, if you like, for those who might want to take advantage of that. Our online congregations can all be found by looking at the list of people who follow our church page. Or if you have a youth group Instagram account, you suddenly have a list that takes you as a link to their personal profile to have a look at those young people. I don't know what the solution is to that, but just to highlight that wider concern. Instagram is mostly used by young people these days. We don't have a huge number of churches that use Instagram at the moment, but more are joining all the time and it's growing. And then once again, I think we will have similar issues and questions as we do currently with Facebook around how those different groups, people, churches, leadership, young people, interact with each other within the platform. I'll stop there. I've talked for quite a while. That brings us to the end of this session, and it's been quite a lot of information from me. I hope it was useful for you. There's obviously many other areas that could be covered, online gaming, email, texting, WhatsApp, and then at the pioneering end of the scale, you've also got those who are now looking at establishing solely online churches that aren't connected in any way to a physical presence or building. And there's even more questions that arise from that scenario. So there's many areas to talk about with online platforms and trying to understand them for a church safeguarding context. But I'll leave it there, briefly covering a whole range of topics. I hope there's been something you can take away with you. Maybe if it's just that it's a really complex area, there's lots of questions we don't have answers to yet. But maybe hopefully it's helped you understand more of the specifics of online platforms and where some of the challenges come from.